The dust of the high plains coats everything, even the inside of her lungs, it feels like sometimes. Ilara stoops, her hand shielding her eyes against the late afternoon sun, scanning the meager creek bed. A flash of something dark, slumped near the willows, snags her attention. It's not an animal. Her heart gives a small, unwelcome lurch. Trouble in these parts usually arrives on two legs. She approaches cautiously, the worn handle of her father's old hunting knife, a familiar pressure in her calloused palm. The man lies face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. His clothes, though torn and dirt-caked, are of a finer cut than any she's seen outside the general store in Redemption, and even then, only on the fanciest of drummers. He's alive. A shallow rise and fall of his back tells her that much. A dark stain mats his hair near the temple. She kneels, prods his shoulder gently. "Mister?" He groans, a low, animal sound of pain. With considerable effort, she turns him over. His face is bruised, a cut above his brow still weeping blood, but it's a strong face, unfamiliar. His eyes flutter open, unfocused, clouded with a bewilderment that seems to go deeper than the pain. "Where?" he rasps, his voice rough. "You're on my land," Ilara says, her voice quiet but firm. "Near Blackwood Creek. Do you know how you got here?" He tries to sit up, winces, and sinks back. I don't know." His gaze searches hers, empty of recognition, not just for her but for himself. "I don't know anything." A chill touches Ilara despite the sun's warmth. He doesn't know who he is. A man with no name, no past, has washed up on the edge of her solitary life. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. And with that blank stare, that utter void where a life should be, Ilara's own carefully constructed, precarious existence tilted on its axis. Ilara's farm wasn't much more than a weathered cabin, a sway-backed barn, and a few acres of stubborn soil that yielded just enough to keep body and soul together, most years. Her parents had carved it from the wilderness, poured their sweat and dreams into it, and left it to her, their only child, along with a legacy of resilience and a deep-seated caution towards the outside world. Since their passing 3 years prior, solitude had been her most constant companion. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles distant, the town of Redemption, a half-day's ride if the weather was kind and her old mare, Bess, was feeling cooperative. The man, she had to call him something, even if only in her thoughts, was a disruption of an order she fiercely protected. He was clean-shaven underneath the grime, suggesting recent respectability, and his hands, though scraped now, were not the calloused, work-worn hands of a drifter or common laborer. They were hands that knew softer things, perhaps ledger books or the reins of a fine horse, not the bite of an axe or the chafe of a plow handle. She'd managed to get him to his feet, his arm heavy across her shoulders, his weight a surprising burden for her wiry frame. Each step towards the cabin was a trial. He stumbled often, his head lolling, muttering disjointed phrases that made no sense. Once inside, she settled him on the narrow cot that served as her own bed, a wave of dismay washing over her as she considered the implications. She had so little to spare. Water was hauled from the creek, food was what she grew or hunted. Another mouth, especially one belonging to an invalid, was a complication she couldn't afford. Yet, to turn him out, in his condition, was unthinkable. The coyotes would have him before nightfall, or he'd wander into worse trouble. Her father had always said, "You help folks who need help, Ilara. Doesn't matter who they are. Common decency ain't common, but it's what separates us from the savages." The memory of his voice, firm and kind, settled her resolve, at least for now. She cleaned his head wound as best she could with boiled water and a strip of clean linen torn from an old shift. He flinched, but didn't protest, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. The gash was deep, angry-looking. She had a small tin of salve, a concoction of herbs her mother had taught her to make, and she applied it gently. His hair, where it wasn't matted with blood, was thick and dark brown, with a touch of grey at the temples that spoke of years, perhaps 40 of them, though it was hard to tell with the bruising and the vacant look in his eyes. Later, as twilight painted the small cabin in shades of purple and grey, She managed to spoon some thin broth into him. He swallowed with difficulty, his gaze still lost. "What? What should I call you?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched for hours, filled only by his labored breaths and the chirp of crickets outside. He looked at her, a flicker of something, perhaps frustration or fear, in his eyes. "I don't know." "Well, I can't keep calling you Mister," she said, a touch of practicality in her tone. "I'll call you Jed, for now. Is that all right?" He nodded slowly, as if the name itself was a weight. "Jed," he repeated, the sound foreign on his tongue. The first few days were a blur of tending to him. His fever rose, and with it, a delirium that brought forth more fragmented whispers, names she didn't recognize, talk of cattle, vast lands, and figures in a ledger. None of it formed a coherent picture, but it hinted at a life far removed from her own. She coaxed water and broth past his lips, bathed his hot forehead, and listened to the restless murmurings, a strange sense of intimacy growing in the small, shared space, an intimacy born of necessity and his utter dependence. The folk in Redemption, few as they were a suspicious lot. Word traveled, even to her isolated farmstead, often carried by the wind itself, it seemed. If Silas Blackwood, her nearest neighbor, happened by and saw a strange man here, questions would be asked, questions she wasn't sure how to answer. A lone woman taking in an unknown man, injured or not, would set tongues wagging, and not kindly. This was a land where reputation was as vital as water, and as easily sullied. This worry gnawed at her, a subtle counterpoint to the more immediate concern of Jed's survival. The sparse landscape outside her window, usually a comfort in its familiarity, now seemed to hold a silent judgment. The wind whispering through the eaves sounded like hushed, critical voices. Jed's fever finally broke on the fourth day. He awoke weak, his eyes clearer, but the slate of his memory remained wiped clean. He looked around the small cabin, at the rough-hewn table, the single chair, the stone hearth, her meager belongings, with a quiet bewilderment. "You've been kind," he said, his voice still weak but steadier. Ilara, who had been mending a tear in her dress by the dim light of the single window, merely nodded. "You needed help." "How long?" "4 days. You had a bad fever." He touched the side of his head gingerly. "My head, it's empty." "The doctor in Redemption said sometimes a hard knock can do that," she offered, though she hadn't spoken to Doc Miller. It was just something she'd heard. Said sometimes it comes back, sometimes it don't. A shadow crossed his face. "And if it doesn't?" Ilara met his gaze. "Then you start from now, I suppose." The words, simple as they were, seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. The decision to let him stay, not just until he was healed, but until what? She didn't know. It wasn't a conscious choice, more a slow yielding to circumstance and a nascent, unacknowledged compassion that went beyond mere duty. He was like a newborn in a man's body, utterly reliant on her for everything, from the food he ate to the context of his own confusing existence. She told herself it was temporary, that once he was strong enough, he'd have to move on, perhaps try to find someone in Redemption who might recognize him. But a small, stubborn part of her resisted the thought. Their first real test came a week later. Jed was stronger, able to sit outside in the sun for short periods. He still had no memory, but a certain vitality was returning to him. Ilara was splitting firewood, a task usually reserved for stronger arms, but hers was sinewed and capable from years of such labor. Jed watched her, his brow furrowed. After a particularly jarring blow that sent a shock up her arms, he stood, a little unsteadily. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet. Ilara paused, surprised. "You sure you're up to it?" He nodded, reaching for the axe. She hesitated, then relinquished it. His grip was awkward at first, as if the tool were unfamiliar. But then, something shifted. His stance firmed. His swing, though lacking its full power, found a rhythm. The wood split cleanly. He looked at the two halves, then at the axe, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Not memory, perhaps, but the ghost of an old skill. He worked for a short while, his movements becoming more fluid, more natural, until beads of sweat stood out on his forehead, and Ilara insisted he rest. "Seems some things your body remembers, Even if your mind don't, she commented, trying to keep her tone light. He sank onto the chopping block, breathing a little heavily. It felt right, holding the axe. He looked at his hands, turning them over. Odd, not knowing what they've done before. This small act, his intuitive handling of the axe, was the first hint of the man he might have been. It also planted a seed of unease in Ilara. If he was capable, if he had skills, what was he doing wandering alone, injured? Was he running from something or someone? The silence of the prairie could hide many secrets, and she had just invited one into her home. Her father's warning about common decency warred with a primal instinct for self-preservation. For now, decency was winning, but the unease remained, a low hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. The vast, empty sky above seemed to watch them, its silence profound, holding its judgment. As Jed regained his physical strength, a routine settled over the small farm. Ilara, accustomed to her solitude, found his presence both a comfort and a constant awareness. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a natural courtesy that seemed out of place with his current, simplified existence. He learned quickly, watching her every move as she tended her small garden, milked the single goat, or mended tools. He began to help, his initial awkwardness giving way to a surprising aptitude. He repaired the loose hinge on the cabin door with a neatness that spoke of a practiced hand, and when she struggled to lift a heavy sack of feed, he was there, his strength more than just recovered. It was inherent. One evening as they sat by the fire, Ilara patching Jed's borrowed shirt, one of her father's old ones, too large for him but the only spare she had, he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "This life, it's hard, but there's an honesty to it." Ilara threaded her needle. "It's all I've ever known." Before, he trailed off, a familiar frustration clouding his features. "I try to grasp it, but it's like smoke. Sometimes there are flashes, a big house, many rooms, horses, more than I can count, and a feeling of pressure, responsibility." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "Does that make any sense?" She nodded slowly. "It sounds like you might have been a man of means, Jed." The thought was not new to her, his speech, his bearing, even the way he held himself when he thought she wasn't looking, hinted at it. A wry, humorless smile touched his lips. A man of means with holes in his pockets, and not a name to call his own. He looked down at his hands, then around the small, sparsely furnished cabin. "Whatever I was, it's gone. This," he gestured to their surroundings, "this is real now." His words resonated with a simple truth that Ilara found herself clinging to. The past was a shadow, but the present was tangible. The warmth of the fire, the shared silence, the slow rebuilding of a man. She was teaching him, not just farm chores, but the rhythms of a life pared down to its essentials, and in turn, he was teaching her something too, though she couldn't quite name it. Perhaps it was the easing of a loneliness she hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to lift. Their fragile peace was threatened by the outside world sooner than she'd hoped. Silas Blackwood, a stooped, weather-beaten man with eyes that missed little, rode over one morning, ostensibly to ask about a stray calf, but Ilara knew his curiosity was the real driver. He'd seen smoke from her chimney at odd hours, perhaps even caught a glimpse of Jed from a distance. "Morning, Ilara," he said, his gaze flicking past her to the cabin, then back. "Everything all right over here?" "Morning, Silas. Same as always," she replied, keeping her voice even. Just then, Jed emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket. He stopped when he saw Silas, a polite but wary look on his face. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Got yourself some help, have you?" "This is Jed," Ilara said, stepping slightly forward. "He's helping out for a bit. A cousin from back east, down on his luck." The lie slipped out, clumsy but necessary. Silas grunted, his gaze lingering on Jed's face, then on his clothes, which, despite Ilara's mending, still looked out of place. "Don't recall you mentioning any cousins from back east." "Distant," Ilara said quickly. "Family you don't see for years, then they turn up." Jed offered a quiet, "Morning, sir," his voice steady. Silas nodded curtly, his suspicion palpable. He asked a few more desultory questions about the calf, then, with a final, lingering look at Jed, he turned his horse and rode off. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Well, that's that. The whole valley will know by sundown." Jed looked concerned. "I've brought you trouble." "It's not your fault," she said, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. "Folks around here just ain't used to strangers." The encounter left a chill in the air. The community, which could be a source of support in dire times, could also be a source of harsh judgment and ostracization. Her lie about him being a cousin felt thin, easily picked apart. The encounter with Silas Blackwood did indeed set tongues wagging. When Ilara next rode into Redemption for supplies, she felt the curious stares, the way conversations quieted as she passed. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, a woman whose pronouncements carried the weight of scripture for some, was noticeably cool. "Heard you took in a stray, Ilara," she said, her voice sharp as she measured out flour. "He's my cousin, Jedediah," Ilara repeated, forcing a firmness into her voice she didn't feel. "Helping out on the farm." Never knew your pa's people had any Jedediahs." Mrs. Henderson sniffed, clearly unconvinced. "A woman alone needs to be careful. Some men are just trouble looking for a place to land." The veiled warning was clear. Ilara paid for her goods, her cheeks burning, and left the store with a sense of unease. The town, once a familiar, if somewhat indifferent, backdrop to her life, now felt alien, judgmental. She saw it reflected in Jed's eyes, too, when she recounted the exchange. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, careful to stay out of sight if anyone approached the farm. The isolation that had once been Ilara's choice now felt imposed, a protective barrier thrown up against the suspicion of others. Despite the external pressures, life within the confines of the farm continued to forge a bond between them. Jed's memory showed no signs of returning, but his personality began to emerge more clearly. He had a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments, a quiet thoughtfulness, and a surprising gentleness with the animals. He spoke of feeling echoes of skills, an understanding of water rights when they discussed the creek drying up, a knowledge of horseflesh when he examined Bess's aging joints, an instinct for numbers when Ilara struggled with her small account book. These were like pieces of a complex puzzle, hinting at a sophisticated past, but with no picture on the box to guide them. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, fierce and unexpected. They rushed to bring in the chickens and secure the barn. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the cabin. Inside, the small space felt even smaller, the storm's fury pressing in on them. A particularly violent clap of thunder made Ilara jump, and a small cry escaped her. Jed, who had been checking the window latch, turned. He saw her fear, and for a moment, his own vacant expression was replaced by something else, a deep, instinctual protectiveness. He moved to her side, not touching her, but his presence was a sudden, solid reassurance. "It'll pass," he said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the storm's rage. "We're safe in here." They stood there for a long moment, listening to the thunder drum overhead, the small cabin a fragile sanctuary against the elements. In that shared moment of vulnerability, something shifted. The roles of caregiver and patient, teacher and student, subtly blurred. They were two people, weathered by different storms, finding a precarious shelter together. The fear Ilara felt was not just of the thunder, but of the growing tendrils of reliance, of affection, that were weaving themselves around her heart. She was beginning to care for this man, this Jedediah with no past, in a way that frightened her. It was a dangerous path, to care for someone who might disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived, or whose past, if it ever caught up with him, might tear them apart. The incident that truly deepened their personal stakes, however, was quieter, less dramatic, but far more profound in its implications. Jed had been clearing a patch of overgrown brush near the creek, a task he'd taken on himself. Ilara found him staring at a small, smooth stone he'd unearthed, turning it over and over in his palm. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes troubled. I think I know this feeling, holding something precious, something lost." He closed his hand around the stone. There was a woman. Her hand was small in mine. We were happy, I think. And then, pain, such pain. His voice was barely a whisper. Ilara's heart constricted. A woman, a wife, children, the possibilities, always lurking in the shadows of his amnesia, suddenly felt stark and real. If he had a family, a life he'd been torn from, Then this quiet interlude on her farm was just that, an interlude. And she, who had begun to imagine a future, however tentative, that included him, would be left with an even deeper solitude than before. "Do you remember her name? Anything else?" Ilara asked, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. He shook his head, the familiar frustration returning. "Just the feeling, like a shard of glass in my heart." He looked at Ilara, his gaze filled with a helpless sorrow. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to. I don't know what I mean." Ilara reached out, instinctively, and laid her hand briefly on his arm. "It's all right, Jed. Maybe it'll come back to you." But even as she said it, a part of her dreaded that possibility. The fragile sanctuary they had built felt suddenly more vulnerable than ever, not to external threats, but to the ghosts of his forgotten life. The growing protectiveness she felt for him was now tinged with a new fear, the fear of losing him not to danger, but to a past she couldn't compete with. The changing seasons mirrored the subtle shifts in their relationship. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp air of autumn. The days grew shorter, the evenings longer, forcing them into closer proximity within the cabin's walls. Jed had become indispensable to the farm's operation. His strength and burgeoning skills made the harsh labor more manageable for Ilara. He repaired the leaky roof, built stronger fences, and even showed a knack for predicting weather changes, an old instinct stirring within him. They fell into a comfortable rhythm of shared work and quiet companionship. Sometimes, in the evenings, Ilara would read aloud from one of her father's few cherished books, tales of adventure or poetry that spoke of distant lands. Jed would listen intently, his gaze fixed on the fire, sometimes asking questions that revealed a keen intellect and a surprising breadth of knowledge he wasn't aware he possessed. One evening, while she read a passage about a man returning home after a long journey, he interrupted her. "Home," he said softly, testing the word. "I wonder if I have one, or if anyone misses me." The question hung in the air, poignant and unanswerable. Ilara felt a pang of guilt for the selfish wish that no one did, that he belonged here, with her. "Someone must," she said, her voice gentle. "A man like you wouldn't just be forgotten." He looked at her then, a deep, searching look that made her heart skip a beat. "Perhaps," he said, "I was meant to find a new home." The implication in his words was unmistakable, a fragile offering of a future together. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The loneliness she had carried for so long felt, for a moment, entirely banished. But fear, a cold counterpoint to hope, swiftly followed. What if his past did return, a past that held obligations, a wife, a family? This tentative peace they had found could be shattered in an instant. The first tangible piece of Jed's past arrived not as a memory, but in the form of a notice tacked to the board outside Redemption's general store. Ilara had ridden in for winter supplies, a knot of unease already present due to dwindling funds and the approaching cold. The paper, stark black ink on white, depicted a crudely drawn likeness of a man, but the description was what seized her attention. Missing, Alistair Thorne, approx. 40 years. Dark hair, grey at temples, well-dressed, last seen near Maverick Pass. Substantial reward for information leading to his whereabouts. Inquire with Pinkerton Agency, Denver office, or local sheriff. Alistair Thorne. The name echoed the flashes of wealth Jed had described. Maverick Pass was a treacherous route, some 60 miles north, known for rock slides and banditry. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just some drifter, this was a man someone important was actively searching for, someone with the means to hire Pinkertons. She stared at the poster, her mind racing. Jed was Alistair Thorne. The implications were staggering. He wasn't just a man of means, he was likely a wealthy one. The substantial reward could solve all her financial worries, could secure her future. But the thought of turning him in, of trading his presence for money, felt like a betrayal so profound it nauseated her. She quickly scanned the rest of the notices, her heart pounding. No one seemed to be paying much attention to this particular poster yet. It looked relatively new. She fought the urge to tear it down. Instead, she completed her purchases with a distracted air, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The ride home was a torment. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, seemed to hide a threat. Jed was mending a harness in the barn when she returned. He looked up, his brow furrowing at her pale, strained face. "Ilara, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't bring herself to tell him, not yet. The knowledge felt too dangerous, too explosive. "Just tired," she lied. "The town was busy." But that night, she couldn't sleep. The name Alistair Thorne replayed in her mind. The reward, the Pinkertons. The life he had, the life that was waiting for him, a life that had no place for a poor farm girl. The fear of losing him was no longer an abstract worry. It had a name and a face on a poster. Her growing affection for him, the tentative hope for a shared future, now seemed like a foolish dream. He belonged to another world, a world that would inevitably reclaim him. The question was, what would she do when it did? Would she stand by and watch him go, or would she be the one to send him back? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, suffocating. The quiet intimacy of the cabin suddenly felt charged with an unbearable tension. The poster haunted Ilara's thoughts. She found herself watching Jed with a new, painful awareness. Every sophisticated turn of phrase, every unconscious gesture of refinement now seemed to scream, Alistair Thorne. She imagined the life he must have led, the grand house, the servants, the important people he knew. It was a world so far removed from her own that it felt like another planet. How could he ever truly be content here, with her, once he knew? Her internal conflict was a constant torment. The reward money would mean security, an end to the grinding poverty that was her constant companion. She could fix the barn roof properly, buy new livestock, perhaps even hire help. But the price was Jed's trust, the quiet peace they had built. It was a price she found increasingly unbearable to consider. Jed, oblivious to the turmoil raging within her, seemed more settled than ever. The rhythms of the farm had become his rhythms. He spoke more freely now, sharing observations, asking questions about the land, about her life before he arrived. There was a growing ease between them, a comfortable companionship that sometimes, in unguarded moments, deepened into something more profound. A shared glance across the dinner table, a moment when their hands brushed while working together. These small things sent jolts of awareness through Ilara, reminders of the man he was, and the man she was coming to love, regardless of his name or his past. One crisp morning, as they were walking the fence line, checking for breaks before the first snow, Jed paused. He looked out over the valley, the autumn colors painting the hillsides in hues of gold and crimson. "You know, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet, "for the first time since I can remember, I don't feel lost." He turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "This place, it feels like I belong here." His words were like a balm to her troubled soul, yet they also sharpened the horns of her dilemma. If he felt he belonged, who was she to tell him he didn't? But the poster, the name Alistair Thorne, the substantial reward, these facts were a looming shadow. Before she could respond, a sound made them both turn. Two riders were approaching from the direction of redemption. They weren't familiar. They rode with a purpose, their attire more suited to city streets than rugged trails. Ilara's heart sank. Pinkertons, or men like them. Jed looked at her, sensing her sudden tension. "Who are they?" "I don't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But she did. They were the past, come to claim him. The two men reined in their horses a respectful distance from the fence line. One was older, with a stern, weathered face and watchful eyes. The other was younger, with an air of impatient authority. "Ma'am," the older one said, tipping his hat slightly. "We're looking for a man. Name of Alistair Thorne. Went missing some months back. There's a notice in town." His gaze swept over Jed, lingering. Ilara felt Jed stiffen beside her. He looked from the men to Ilara, a dawning confusion, then a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps the first stirrings of a buried memory, in his eyes. "My name is Jed," he said, his voice steady, though Ilara could feel the tension radiating from him. "I don't know any Alistair Thorne." The younger man snorted. "He fits the description. Been a head injury, has he? Amnesia?" He looked at Jed with a dismissive air. "Mr. Thorne is a very wealthy man. His family is most anxious for his return." "Family," Jed echoed, the words sounding foreign. He looked at Ilara, a desperate question in his eyes. Ilara stepped forward. "This is Jedediah Smith, my cousin," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "He came to me a few months ago, injured and having lost his memory, it's true. But he's no Alistair Thorne. He's a simple man, helping me on my farm." She was clinging to the lie, to the life they had built, with a fierce desperation. The older Pinkerton, whose name was apparently Agent Davies, regarded her thoughtfully. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Alistair Thorne is the owner of the Circle T Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory. He has a wife, Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, and business partners who are very concerned. If this is him, and you've been sheltering him without notifying anyone, there could be complications." A wife. The word struck Ilara like a physical blow. Eleanor Thorne, a name to go with the faceless woman Jed had vaguely remembered, the shard of glass in his heart. Jed was staring at Agent Davies, his face pale. "A wife?" he whispered. "Eleanor?" The name seemed to resonate deep within him. He put a hand to his temple, a look of intense pain and confusion crossing his features. Images, fragmented and chaotic, flashed through his mind. A woman's face, smiling, then weeping, the grand facade of a sprawling ranch house, the angry shouts of men in a smoke-filled room, a horse rearing, the ground rushing up to meet him. "Alistair?" Ilara said softly, her heart breaking. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a dawning horror and recognition. I think, I remember." The dam of his amnesia was cracking, fragments of his past life flooding in. He remembered arguments, accusations, a desperate ride to escape, something. He remembered Eleanor, her cool beauty, their increasingly strained marriage, driven by his relentless ambition and her social aspirations. The younger agent, whose name was Wilkes, pushed forward. "Well, Mr. Thorne, is it you or not? We don't have all day." Alistair, for it was undeniably him now, the memories, however painful and disjointed, anchoring him to that identity, straightened. The quiet farmer, Jed, was receding, replaced by a man of authority, a man used to command. But his eyes, when they met Ilara's, were filled with a profound anguish. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse, "I am Alistair Thorne." The words sealed their fate. Ilara felt a cold despair wash over her. It was over. The quiet life, the burgeoning love, all of it was dust. "Then you'll come with us, Mr. Thorne," Agent Davies said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your wife will be overjoyed." Overjoyed? Alistair doubted that. The last memories surfacing were of bitter recriminations, of Eleanor accusing him of caring more for his empire than for her. He remembered riding out in a fury, taking a dangerous shortcut through Maverick Pass, a decision that had nearly cost him his life. He looked at Ilara, at the small weathered cabin that had been his sanctuary, at the woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, who had given him a new life when his old one was lost. He saw the pain in her eyes, the quiet devastation, and a different kind of ache, sharper than any memory, pierced through him. He began, wanting to say something, anything, to explain, to thank her, to tell her what she had come to mean to him. But Wilkes was impatient. "Let's go, Thorne. We've wasted enough time." Alistair Thorne, the millionaire rancher, took one last look at Ilara, at the life he was leaving behind. Then, with a heavy heart, he turned and walked towards the waiting horses, towards a past he now remembered, and a future he no longer desired. Ilara watched him go, tears streaming down her face, the sound of the retreating hoofbeats like the final closing of a door on a happiness she had only just begun to taste. The prairie wind whipped around her, cold and unforgiving, carrying away the last vestiges of her fragile dream. The days that followed Alistair's departure were the bleakest Ilara had ever known. The cabin felt hollow, echoing with his absence. Every task, once shared, was now a solitary burden, a constant reminder of what she had lost. The reward money, a substantial sum delivered by a stoic Agent Davies a week later, with a terse note of thanks from the Thorne estate, sat untouched in a tin box beneath her floorboards. It felt like blood money, a payment for her silence, for her complicity in his return to a life she sensed he didn't want. Alistair, meanwhile, found himself thrust back into a world that felt both familiar and alien. The Circle T Ranch was as vast and opulent as his fragmented memories suggested. His wife, Eleanor, greeted him with a carefully orchestrated display of relief and concern, but her eyes were cool, appraising. His business partners, a consortium of ambitious men, were eager to have him back at the helm, their talk of profits and expansion grating on his ears. His memory, now mostly restored, was a painful tapestry of ambition, wealth, and emotional emptiness. He remembered the relentless drive that had built his empire, and the loneliness that had been its constant companion. He remembered Eleanor's unhappiness, her accusations of neglect, his own inability to connect with her on any meaningful level. But interwoven with these harsh realities were the softer, warmer memories of Ilara's farm. The quiet evenings by the fire, her gentle voice reading to him, the shared labor under the wide prairie sky, the taste of her simple, nourishing food, the profound sense of peace he had found in her presence. He remembered her strength, her kindness, her unwavering decency. He remembered the feel of her hand on his arm, the concern in her eyes, the way she had made him feel whole. The contrast between the two lives was stark, unbearable. The luxury of the Circle T felt like a gilded cage. The endless meetings, the social obligations, the constant pressure. It was the life he had built, the life he had supposedly wanted, but now it felt suffocating. He found himself staring out of the windows of his grand study, not at his sprawling lands, but towards the distant, hazy outline of the mountains, in the direction of Ilara's small, secluded farm. He learned, through discreet inquiries, that Ilara had been given the reward. He also learned that she hadn't touched it. This knowledge settled deep within him, a testament to her character. She hadn't wanted his money, she had wanted him, Jed. The realization of what he had lost, what he had walked away from, grew with each passing day. He had regained his name, his fortune, his past, but he had lost the only true happiness he had ever known. Weeks turned into a month. The first snows dusted the plains. Alistair found himself increasingly withdrawn, his interactions with Eleanor strained, his interest in his business empire waning. One evening, during a tense dinner, Eleanor confronted him. "You're not the same, Alistair," she said, her voice brittle. "You're distant. It's like part of you is still out there." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps the best part of me is," he said quietly. The finality of his decision came to him not in a flash of insight, but as a slow, steady dawning, like the prairie sunrise. He knew what he had to do. His old life, with its wealth and its emptiness, was no longer his. His new life, the one he had stumbled into by accident, the one he had shared with Ilara, was the only one that held any meaning. He made arrangements. He met with his lawyers, his business partners. He was methodical, decisive, the old Alistair Thorne reasserting himself, but with a new purpose. He ensured Eleanor would be well provided for, more than well, in fact. He signed over a significant portion of his holdings to her, effectively dissolving their marriage of convenience. He divested himself of the daily operations of the ranch, placing it under capable management, retaining only enough to secure a comfortable, but not extravagant, future. He was shedding his old skin, preparing for a new beginning. Then, one cold morning, with a single valise containing a few essentials and a heart full of trepidation and hope, he rode out from the Circle T, not as Alistair Thorne, millionaire rancher, but simply as a man seeking the woman who had given him a reason to live. He didn't ride his finest stallion, but a sturdy, unassuming gelding. He wasn't heading towards power or prestige, but towards a small, weathered cabin, and a love he prayed was not entirely lost. Ilara was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar counterpoint to the winter silence, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Her heart, which had settled into a dull ache of resignation, gave a painful lurch. She looked up, expecting perhaps Silas Blackwood or some other curious neighbor. But the man who dismounted was Alistair, or Jed. He looked different. His clothes were simple but well made. His bearing still carried a hint of his former authority, but his eyes were filled with an uncertainty, a vulnerability that reminded her so much of the injured man she had first found by the creek. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. "Ilara," he said finally, his voice hoarse. She lowered the axe slowly, her hands trembling. "Alistair, what are you doing here?" "My name," he said, taking a step closer, "is Jed, if you'll still have me." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. But your wife? Your ranch? Eleanor and I, we were never truly man and wife, not in the ways that matter. She has the ranch, the fortune. She'll be fine. He took another step. I wasn't fine, Ilara. Not there, not without you. He stopped a few feet from her. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I left, I hurt you. But that life, it wasn't life. It was an existence. You showed me what living truly is. You gave me a new life, Ilara, and in that life, I found love. His confession hung in the cold air. Ilara felt tears welling in her eyes, hot against her chilled skin. "Oh, Jed," she whispered, the name a comfort on her tongue. He reached out, tentatively, and took her hand. His was warm, strong. "I don't have much to offer you now, not in the way the world measures wealth, just myself, my heart. A willingness to work by your side, to build a life here, with you, if you'll let me." Ilara looked into his eyes and saw not Alistair Thorne, the powerful rancher, but Jed, the man she had nursed back to health, the man she had taught and learned from, the man she loved with every fiber of her being. The emptiness that had filled her since he left was suddenly, miraculously, gone, replaced by a hope so bright it was almost painful. She didn't need to say anything. Her answer was in the tears that now flowed freely, in the way her fingers tightened around his. She stepped forward, into his embrace, and he held her close, burying his face in her hair. "I never touched the reward money," she murmured against his chest. "It didn't feel right." He held her tighter. "It wouldn't have. What we have, what we can build together, that's the only reward that matters." They stood there for a long time, in the quiet of the snow-dusted farm, two souls reunited, their pasts shed, their future stretching before them, as vast and promising as the prairie sky. He had lost a fortune and a name, but he had found himself, and a love more precious than any earthly wealth. She had faced hardship and heartbreak, but her compassion had brought her the one thing her heart truly desired. The small cabin, once a symbol of her solitude, now felt like the center of the universe, a sanctuary for a love that had defied memory, wealth, and distance. He watched her smile, a genuine, joyful smile that reached her eyes, and he knew he was finally home. The late afternoon sun, weak as it is in winter, casts long shadows across the snow. Inside the small cabin, a fire crackles warmly in the hearth. Ilara is mending a shirt, her movements deft and familiar. Jed sits across from her, whittling a piece of wood, the shavings falling silently to the floor. There's a quiet contentment in the air, a sense of peace hard-won. He looks up, catching her eye, and a slow smile spreads across his face, a smile she returns without hesitation. The vast ranch, the forgotten fortune, the empty society life, these are just distant echoes now. Here, in this small, simple space, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the land and the unwavering strength of their shared affection, they have found everything that truly matters. He reaches across the small space between them, and his hand covers hers, calloused now from honest labor, a silent promise of a future built together, day by day, season by season. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.